Oh scheisse, it's the Ogre boys. They've finally arrived in Warhammer 2, but maybe not quite in the capacity that many had hoped for. To clarify right now, the Ogre Kingdoms as a faction are not in Warhammer 2. At least not yet, maybe. But there are 5 Ogre mercenary units that are recruitable in campaign for every single faction. Here's how it works. So in any Warhammer 2 campaign, you may be greeted with this message: Ogre Mercenaries arrive. This lets you know that there's mercenaries in the region, they have a camp, and if you go there, you can recruit them into your service. The camp is very obvious, as you can see, and all you have to do is move one of your armies there to get the option to recruit them. So I'm going to take this Beastmen army, walk into the circle, and we will be greeted with options, where you can get different combos of Ogre units. We could get some normal ogres with dual weapons, 2 of those, and 1 Maneater with great weapons. We could get 2 normal ogres and 1 Maneaters with pistols, so a little bit of ranged power, or 2 Mournfang cavalry. So let's say we choose the cavalry, we're going to click on that, and then they're not going to be recruited instantly into our army, but we have a recruitment pool down the bottom. Click on this, and this is all the ogre units that we have available. We've just taken the 2 cavalries, you can see we don't have any of the others, and we can take these 2 when we want to. They're quite expensive, so you might not want them right away, but you can have them there when you need them. And then much like Regiments of Renown, they'll be instantly recruited into your army when you choose to take them, which means they can be very useful for emergencies. But what of the actual units themselves? What are they like? What are their stats? Well, let's have a look. Firstly, the cheapest and simplest boys of the bunch, regular old Ogres. They are a damage dealer with decent armor piercing damage and weapon strength, a nice charge bonus to help out their melee attack, which isn't that great at only 30, so they really need that charge bonus, but their defenses overall are pretty bad. 40 armor, only 60 leadership, and 23 melee defense, so they're not super tough, they're not going to stick in the fight for a long time, but they will hit hard, and they probably want to cycle charge a bit because they've got that big charge bonus and lack of melee attack. They do cause fear and have an Ogre charge ability, which means when they charge a braced unit like spearmen that are stood still, they'll only lose half of their charge bonus instead of the whole thing, so that's going to help them fighting those anti-large units. They're also pretty quick on their feet with 54 speed. They can move when they have to. Next, Ogres with dual weapons, basically the same unit as before, a little bit less weapon strength, but they do have a bonus versus infantry now, which is really nice and makes them great anti-infantry because it'll help bring up their relatively mediocre melee attack. Not to mention, you can double that up with a charge bonus, so they can be a proper damage dealer. Again, they have that Ogre charge, so similar to the regular Ogres, just better at the job. Both of these Ogre units have pretty high health balls at 6,500 as well, but that's nothing too out of the ordinary. Pretty standard for monstrous infantry, but at the higher end. Then we have Maneaters with great weapons. These are the slightly more elite ogres of the bunch. They have a big old 7,300 health first of all. They still don't have any armor, but their leadership is much better. Still a damage dealer, but more about taking out the large now. They have an anti-large bonus, armor piercing weapon strength, which is pretty huge. Much better melee attack and melee defense than the normal ogres. Still got a big charge bonus. They cause fear, immunity to psychology, and have the Ogre charge, so just a much better version of the regular Ogres, and these ones all about taking out the cavalry and monsters. And then we have Maneater's Ogre Pistol. These are still great in melee, got all the great Maneater stats as the previous unit, just not anti-large now. And of course the Ogre Pistol gives them a ranged attack, which is pretty strong at 96 armor piercing damage, and a big range at 140, that's the same as Empire handgunners. So these provide a nice armor piercing missile choice, but still a unit that can get stuck into melee and do some work there. Pretty significant for those factions that don't have a lot of missiles, like the Chaos or the Vampire Counts, so they can change the game up. And lastly, the Mournfang Cavalry. I'm not entirely sure what these big boys are riding. At a glance it looks like a boar, but when you look closer it doesn't look that piggy, so I'm not sure, but they are cavalry all the same. They are ogres and not man-eaters, so not quite as tough. They do have pretty good armor though, but are lacking in the leadership. Their speed is pretty good. Nice melee attack as well. Their melee defense isn't bad for a shock cavalry. Nice big weapon strength, which is armor piercing, and a massive charge bonus on top of that means they do brutal damage on the charge. So just a big, heavy hitting, high mass cavalry that can do a lot of damage. They can smash infantry, hammer and anvil. They can probably bash cavalry, maybe even get into some monsters a little bit. They are beefy. And all of these Ogre units have Siege Attacker as well, so they can be really useful in sieges for bashing down those doors. Very handy if you don't have artillery or any other monsters. So that is all of the Ogre units coming to Warhammer 2 very, very soon. Now just to talk about my experience with them, in terms of campaign, not entirely sure what makes them appear. If you're wondering, how do I make the Ogre camps arrive and appear? Do I have to do something? There doesn't appear to be any obvious indicator on how you get them to arrive, but they do come quite often. Maybe every 20 to 30 turns one will appear, and the Ogre camps are never very far away from you, so you can usually get there in one turn. So yeah, it's quite easy to get them when they do appear. So yeah, you shouldn't be waiting long until you encounter some Ogres, as any faction. That's the big thing about this. Any faction can recruit Ogres, which can be a pretty big game changer, especially for factions like the Dwarfs, who don't have cavalry. Well, now in campaign, they have cavalry, which is pretty huge. The Vampire Counts will have missiles, the Chaos will have some new missiles, all the factions that kind of have weaknesses. The Skaven don't have cavalry, well, now they have cavalry, potentially if they want it. So it's a pretty big game changer for campaign, especially as not just because you can recruit the Ogres, but the AI can as well. So you could see Ogres in any army of any faction at any time. One concern you might have is that you're going to start seeing Ogres in every single AI army. Well, that hasn't been the case so far. It did get reduced a little bit as well in an update to the first build I got. But yeah, you do see the Ogres around, but it hasn't been too much. The other thing you might be wondering is there a limit cap on how many Ogre units I can have or how many I can recruit to an army? The answer is no. You can potentially have a full army of Ogres if you want to, albeit that'll probably be very expensive, but hella fun, I'm sure. The other big question some people will be asking is multiplayer. Will I be able to use Ogres in multiplayer? Yes, but only as campaign exclusives for any faction though. So if you're playing a custom multiplayer battle, you'll be able to include them if you want to, but if it's quick battles or any kind of tournament, you're probably not going to be able to use them. So yeah, that's all the information I have for you on Ogres. They are pretty fun to include into the army, but what does it really mean? Are we still going to get the Ogre Kingdoms faction? Is this CA's way of saying, sorry, we're not going to do the Ogre Kingdoms faction, but here's some Ogres as mercenaries. Enjoy. Because some people say they don't think the Ogre Kingdoms could work in Total War because they're all large, so all you need to do to beat them is just bring an army of anti-large stuff, and they're going to struggle. So there's that theory, but I do think we'll see the Ogre Kingdoms as a faction. I'm sure they can find a way to make them work. They've got that Ogre Charge, for example, that ability that means they don't lose all their charge bonus when they charge. Those kind of little things could give them a defense against an army of anti-large units. But what do you think? How are you feeling about Ogre Mercenaries in Warhammer 2? Which I think is part of the nice surprise. Nobody expected Ogres to come to Warhammer 2. Warhammer 3 was the obvious place that they would be, and maybe their full faction will be. We shall see. Hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. See you in the future.